Hello everybody, I'm Chris, and I'd like to welcome everyone back to my series, which I am calling Blueprint for Composition. In this section of the series today, we're going to be looking a little bit more closely at what are known as subordinate clauses. And today we're going to be looking at one particular type of subordinate clause, known as the adverb clause. So, in a previous installment of this series, I introduced and defined and gave some examples of things known as complex sentences. So it's very important to realize how the complex sentence is different from the simple sentence and the compound sentence. So we did walk through a practice exercise on how to distinguish between these types of sentences. So we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into complex sentences and more specifically into adverb clauses. So just to review quickly the components that are needed to form a complex sentence. So complex sentences, as you see here, are composed of two things: a subordinate clause plus one independent clause. So one subordinate clause plus one independent clause equals a complex sentence. So in the previous video, we talked about the definition of a subordinate clause, and we also gave an alternative name for a subordinate clause, which was the dependent clause. So the dependent clause is another word for subordinate clause. And I explained in the previous video that dependent clauses must be attached to an independent clause in order to form a complex sentence. In other words, you cannot separate out the subordinate clause from the independent clause as a separate sentence. In doing that, you would create what is known as a sentence fragment. So, one more time, the subordinate clause is necessarily attached to the independent clause to form the complex sentence. Okay? So, we talked about that in the previous video. Now, I also mentioned that there are three major types or three major classifications of subordinate clauses. One is known as the adjective clause, another is known as the noun clause, and the third type is known as the adverb clause. So today, we're going to describe what adverb clauses consist of, or how you can identify adverb clauses in sentences. So, an adverb clause, or any subordinate clause, will be composed of a connector, a subject, and a verb. So, another word for connector here, I like to use the word connector, subordinate clause connector. I just find it easier and more facile to remember. So, connector, another word is subordinating conjunction. So, when we are looking at these types of constructions, we need to find where the clause begins. Where does the subordinate clause begin? So, we have to identify the subordinate clause connector, or the subordinating conjunction. So, the connector will be followed by a subject, and it will also have a verb because it is a type of clause. So remember, clauses are made up of subjects, verbs, and phrases, mainly speaking. So, in this case, what types of conjunctions can be used to begin adverb clauses? Well, adverb clauses show relationships of ideas, as we expressed in the previous video. So what kind of ideas can be shown by adverb clauses? What kind of relationships of ideas? So, on the board here, you will notice I have four types of adverb clause connectors. One, adverb clauses of time. Two, adverb clauses, connectors that show contrast. Three, adverb clause connectors that show relationship of cause and effect. And four, an adverb clause connectors of condition. So, when we're looking at a sentence and seeing how a sentence is constructed with these adverb clauses, we need to be on the lookout for these types of connectors depending on the relationship of the ideas expressed in the sentence. So probably the most common types of subordinating conjunctions for adverb clauses would be the time connectors. So words like after, words like before, words like when. Now, this is not a complete list. I just put this up here for purposes of illustration. There are other types of connectors or other connectors that you could put in these categories, but these would be the most commonly used, of course. So, after, before, when would be very commonly used as time connectors. For contrast situations, you could think about looking for words like although, even though, and though. Very commonly used to show contrast. Cause and effect we talked about in the previous video. Because would be a very common conjunction to use to start an adverb clause of cause and effect. You could also use since, however, to show that same kind of cause and effect relationship, or to introduce that kind of cause and effect relationship. And then under the category of condition, adverb clauses of condition, they generally involve using the word if as a conjunction, and or even if. So the word whether or whether or not would also fall under this category of condition. But if and even if are very commonly used. So again, how do you go about composing a sentence that contains an adverb clause in relation to the main clause or independent clause? Well, there are two ways that you can go about it. You can put the adverb clause at the beginning of a sentence and then use a comma as a method to join it with the independent clause. Or you can put the independent clause first and then put the adverb clause at the end without a comma. So, looking at these examples down here, we'll highlight how it works. So the first sentence says, I'll let you know when I'm finished. Okay? So step one, we have to identify where the adverb clause begins. So as I said, what we are looking for is we're looking for the subordinating conjunction, or the subordinate clause connector. So in this sentence, I'm looking at the word when. So when would then fall under the category of adverb clause of time. So when I'm finished, there's your subject and verb right there. So I being your subject and am finished being your verb. So in this case, the subordinate clause, the adverb clause, comes after the main clause. I'll let you know is your independent clause. So when we do this, when we put the adverb clause at the end of a sentence, in this case, at the second part of the complex sentence, we do not need a comma right there. All right? No comma is needed when the adverb clause comes at the position after the main clause. Let's look at the second example. Second example. Although he studied hard, comma, he didn't do well on the test. So again, where are we going to start looking for the adverb clause is by looking for one of these connectors. So right here, right off the bat, I notice I have the word although. So although is under the category of contrast. So we're setting up a contrast situation here. So you notice here, although he studied hard, the comma is right there. And this is because the adverb clause comes at the beginning of the sentence. So although he studied hard, comma, and then your main clause or independent clause, he didn't do well on the test. So how does this sentence show contrast? Well, although is another word for contrast is opposition. So what we're showing here is the result is sort of in opposition or contrast to the expectation. So we would think if someone studied hard, that particular person would do well on the test. But what we're saying in this case is that the outcome was negative. He didn't do well on the test. So that's the contrast. He studied hard, he didn't do well on the test. So how are we going to connect these two ideas? With a word like although, because we're contrasting, right? We have a negative verb over here, didn't do, but we have a positive or affirmative verb over here, he studied. So it's like when we talked about compound sentences and joining two independent clauses together with a comma and a conjunction, we could have used the word but to combine these two sentences together as well. He studied hard, but he didn't do well on the test. It also shows contrast. So in this case, we're using a different sentence construction, the complex sentence. But we're accomplishing the same thing. We're showing contrast. All right, number 3. Third example. Since it was snowing, comma, school was delayed. All right? Another example where you have the adverb clause first. All right? Since here is your connector. It was snowing is your subject and verb. And then you have the main clause, school was delayed, subject school, verb was. Or was delayed. So, again, looking at these examples, we see a comma here, right there, separating or joining the main and the subordinate clause. Because, again, the subordinate clause is at the beginning of the sentence. We're introducing the sentence with the subordinate clause. So in general, whenever you introduce a sentence with a adverb clause, any one of these, you're going to use a comma to put it together with the main clause. So since it was snowing, comma, school was delayed. All right. Now this is not a time connector, right? Don't be confused. This is not an adverb clause of time. This is actually cause and effect, which is over here. So what are we saying here? Since it was snowing, comma, school was delayed. So here we have the cause, here we have the effect, the reason, the result. So this is definitely a cause and effect relationship between these two ideas. Since it was snowing, comma, school was delayed. Cause and effect. All right, let's look at the last example on the board here. It says, I wouldn't go to the party even if I had been invited. Okay? So this is a condition. What you're basically saying is, I wouldn't go to the party under any condition. I wouldn't go to the party under any circumstance. So what you're basically saying in this sentence is that no matter what, you're not going. All right? But here's your connector right here, even if. So notice again, no comma is needed in this location because we're not starting the sentence with the subordinate clause. We're ending the sentence with the subordinate clause. So I wouldn't go to the party even if I had been invited. Even if I had been invited is your subordinate clause. I wouldn't go to the party is your independent or main clause. So there's two things to remember about locations of adverb clauses in complex sentences in terms of punctuation. So the first rule is that when the subordinate clause follows the main clause, as in this example and the fourth example, you do not need a comma in between the two clauses. In the second and third examples, you do have the independent clause after the subordinate clause, or you could say it another way, the subordinate clause comes first and then the independent clause comes second. So in those cases where you start the sentence with the subordinate clause, you do need a comma to join those two ideas together. All right? So that's the basic outline of how to look at sentences and decide. In this case, we're talking about complex sentences which contain adverb clauses of time, of contrast, of cause and effect, and condition. So this is just a basic overview. In our next installment, we'll look at some examples of adverb clauses and do a little exercise on how to identify adverb clauses in sentences, and then we'll get into things like adjective clauses and noun clauses. So that's about all for now. Hopefully this was a little bit helpful in terms of deepening your understanding of how adverb clauses work. And then, as I said in the next example, we'll get into some exercises and try those. All right, so that's all for now. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you again very soon.